being outlaws is in our DNA. That's what it is to be American. We're always the rebel opposition. We're always outnumbered. We're always hated. We're also feared and respected. I wouldn't have things any other way. I'm having a good time.
Hello, evening, and welcome to the Greene Tavern. I'm joined tonight by our host, Mr. Repeal to Heaven, and we have Kaiser on with us tonight. Luke, our president, will be joining us shortly. I am KevBot. Thank y'all for tuning in tonight. Our guest for tonight is Mr. C.Jay Engel. Mr. Engel, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Great. Colt, would you like to get us started?
Yeah. So you have a podcast called Canterbury Trails, and it's actually a pretty informative podcast about the roots of Anglicanism. Could you kind of go into kind of a broad view, like a 3,000 foot view of what you guys are trying to do there?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's the podcast that I'm not known for, but that's kind of like a personal passion project of mine. I would say a lot of it is like we're all in this milieu of rediscovery of the past. The scholars call it resourcement. And so we're all on this like backwards trajectory to kind of recover our heritage theologically and politically, culturally as well. And so I think that a lot of that is just me wanting to explore that with someone that I've known for a decade, Jared Lavelle. He's someone that I trust. He's very knowledgeable in these areas. And so that's just something that I've been very attracted to personally. I've grown to love appreciate and even become more aware of our like Anglican patrimony in America. And people don't really think of it. They think of the Anglican Church as, basically like just gay and paused and longhouse and all that stuff, which is very true. But the Anglican Church of history is actually very much everything we would want it to be if we're going to have something that's theologically robust, culturally rich. All of those things are deep within the Anglican ethos, and you can't really understand the American culture or political or theological tradition without understanding Anglican history. So much of what I do with that show is me trying to chase. A lot of it's been theology so far, but we really want to get into literature and music and culture, because the American ethos and our heritage cannot really be fully appreciated if you don't understand the Anglican way of life, but also the Anglican Church. There's, everyone knows Roger Scruton, pretty typical traditionalist conservative. He has this book called Our Church, and he's not really like a, like theologically, like what would the word be? Like he's not very evangelical, so he wouldn't really take it seriously in an individualistic way, like Charlie Kirk or something. Like Roger Scruton is a totally different world than that. But what Roger Scruton explains in Our Church is that you cannot have an English culture without the function of the church. And so he describes it basically as being the repository of English culture. The Church of England held English culture in sort of trust. It held it in trust, and it could last beyond the life of any one individual. So when we think of English culture, I mean, we're thinking of people like, all the way back to like King Alfred. We're thinking of Shakespeare, and we're thinking of people way outside of the church. But the church itself kind of held those things in trust and passed them on from one decade, one century to the next over time. And we are sort of derivative of the Anglican experience. And so part of my seeking to understand my own American heritage made me appreciate and long to look deeper into the Anglican as well. So that's kind of what I'm doing. And I think we're on episode, 16 or 17 now. So we have a long way to go, but it's something that I hope over the coming years will be very fruitful and beneficial for myself and for anyone who finds it.
Excellent. Yeah, there's 3 episodes that I think has really stuck out in my head besides one of the last ones you guys did. And one of them was with William Tyndale and talking about the English translation of the Bible, which we formerly know today as the King James Bible. The King James Commission, I think they used about 80% of Tyndale's work. The other one was about music within the Anglican Church. A lot of our Christmas carols and beautiful hymns that we have today, they all come out of the Anglican tradition. And the last one was kind of I guess you say like the liturgical calendar a little bit, and how the English kind of held that together around and centered around the church with different kind of feast days. I know there's some overlapping there with how Lutherans view that, but I'd like to touch back on that King James Bible. And it was the Bible that I grew up reading. It was the Bible that my father grew up reading, my grandfather, his father, going all the way back to the 1630s. And I think what we have today is a lot of confusion. I'll preface this, I'm not a KJV onlyist guy, but I was in a conversation with some fellow reformers, and we were chatting Sunday about this, about that the ESV translation, they like it, but there's always updates to it. It's constantly changing. It's not stable in the sense of, well, I've got a ESV 2000, what number, and this person has the new updated version of the ESV, what number. And it's kind of problematic when you're sitting in church and you have the pastor reading, he has an older version, you have someone having a newer version of it, and there's a little word change here or a left out word there. But that we were all sitting there talking about, well, one Bible that hasn't changed is the King James version. It's been pretty much the same for 400 years. Besides, I think they changed 2 words or made a typo correction or something like that in the 1900s. It's very minimal that doesn't really affect anything. So, could you kind of dive a little bit into the King James Bible, which I would kind of consider a historical heritage American translation of the Bible that animated everything from the founding fathers, what they were reading, to I know some people might not like him, and I've got some strong opinions. Abraham Lincoln, how he actually was an orator and kind of used that language from the King James Bible, just kind of, broad brush stroke right there with that.
Yeah. So my great grandfather was in World War II. He was in the Pacific Theater, And we have some of his paraphernalia, and one of the things that we have is his Bible that was given to him by the United States Air Force. Because they used to do that. um, Today you can't do that because people would freak out. But the Bible is in a King James translation because that's what they had. That's what they did. And just looking at that and realizing that my great grandfather is reading this Bible. It's one of the it's one of the small Bibles that they can take out there. So I think it's just like the New Testament and then maybe the Psalms. And so if you
It's a
open
Gideon Bible usually, I believe. It has the Psalms, Proverbs, and then the New Testaments. I actually had one
exactly,
overseas
yeah,
as well.
yeah,
I
it's
took my
some,
father's with me.
yeah, exactly. So, but this Bible that carried them through war, and I'm not like a huge like, yeah, World War II is great guy at all. But he took this Bible out and he experienced um war, the face of war, the tragedies of war, and the hell of war. And the thing that he read to comfort himself was this Bible translation that had been used for centuries, and it's still accessible to me today. Now, like when we think about like the problems with post-modernity or modernity, one of the things that constantly comes up is we're deracinated. That means we have no connection to our own past. There's no roots. We're an individual. History doesn't matter. We can define ourselves. We're born in 1990s or whatever, and nothing before that really matters. I mean, maybe the 1960s matter, but anything before the 1960s doesn't matter. And that's kind of the way that we operate. And I think if we as Americans are going to recover our heritage, we have to learn to appreciate the little residues of continuity that we have today that can lead us back in time. Now, there's in the 21st century, and I actually made this point on Twitter and kind of got in trouble for it, but one of the things that we have at our disposal is the internet. We have ridiculous amounts of tools and concordances and dictionaries and etymology, tools and all these things that can help us really understand and parse down to the Greek, and we can get the perfect translation. They have an entirely new translation that comes out every year, and this one's more grammatically correct. And what we're losing, though, is that cultural continuity. And the thing that began to dawn on me was maybe in the making of a holistic man, the cultural continuity and connecting ourselves with the past is actually more important than these minute, minuscule grammatical details that we obsess over, raise millions of dollars so that we can publish this new Bible and make sure we have a custom consumer base that can buy this new Bible. It's like maybe the manufacturing and consumption orientedness of our, even the way that we read the Bible, needs to be rethought. And maybe it's healthier for man to read along the same rhythms of the Bible, of anything, but especially the Bible, that our grandparents did, that their grandparents did, all the way back deep into our own past. And so, that's kind of the, like, one of the several cases for the King James and appreciating it is the fact that, like, when you read Psalm 23, right, he has that in his little army Bible, and the cadence and the flow, the phraseology that comes out of that, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, the these and thous that come through that passage. There's no other Bible in the world that's structured according to the English flow of English prose. People don't realize that. I mean, the King James Bible doesn't just take a word for word translation from the Greek, because it wouldn't fit right, because the English has a different type of flow and structure and all those things. So the way that we experience our own culture and the way that we experience the Christian religion within our own context is very much connected to who we are as human beings and who we are as Americans and derivatives of the Anglo experience. And so, one of the cases for the King James Bible, the New King James Bible is the one that we use at church, but the King James Bible especially, is that it is something that we can use to commune with the saints who came before us and who are no longer with us. And I think that's a type of thinking that is completely foreign to 21st and 20th century thinking, that when we talk about gathering together as a community to read the Bible, there's something missing in if we just have the newest tools. I mean, we kind of feel that something's wrong if the pastor stood up and preached a sermon from an iPhone. It's kind of weird because you lose that continuity over time. There's something that's actually deeper, even liturgical, about having these things. So that was initially the thing that made me realize that, like, even having the best cutting edge research into newer translations doesn't always make the person whole. And it certainly has not helped, the state of Christianity in America or the West. And so that was one of the things I think that came out of our discussion that Jared and I had, is that the King James version is very much something that shaped the religious mind of the American ethos in the 18th century. There would have been no American Christianity as we understand it if they weren't reading from and repeating and memorizing and catechizing out of this King James version. And so it very much shaped us. It wasn't something that you can just look at as just like a random tool, like a hammer. It doesn't matter. It's the same in anyone's hand. It really was made by and made for and shaped the future of the American people. And so rethinking, tools like the Bible translations themselves and connecting with the past is something that we need to think about all over the map, but especially in our Bible translations.
No, I think you're touching on something that is probably one of the least appreciated things that definitely needs to be appreciated more in the church world, which is that you don't actually always need to have the most accurate translation to, like, how do we get the exact defined meaning in order to convey everything possible to people. For the average layman, they're not going to get as much out of that as they would out of just reading, like, what is objectively a far more beautiful translation, what is going to connect with them more, what is going to, like, show them more of just the beauty of the gospel, because it is objectively a far more beautiful thing. I actually recommend people, if you are, like, just getting into the Bible, if you haven't read it before, read King James first. If you're an English speaker, it is probably the better one to start with, because you're not going to get as much out of these, like, giant study Bibles with all of these different things to it, because you're not at that place where you really need to understand that. Just reading the word and appreciating it for what it is, which is a beautiful story from the author of, all of creation, is far better and more impactful for you as a Christian, especially getting into it.
Yeah.
And okay, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah, fair enough. I did want to segue a little bit. So going into America too, it seems like we also have this issue where we lose our historicity. And this is where I also get out, and alongside John Harris and other guys, where we're just hammering that, hey, look, the Pilgrims were not the foundation. You get taught this in school, that this is where everything started, Pilgrim Rock, all of that. Jamestown was up and running 13 years prior to that. If you want to get into North Carolina, you had Roanoke, but Roanoke failed. Jamestown is where America actually started. And the Jamestown religion the Virginian religion really was Anglicanism, correct?
Yeah. I think that's basically right. Anglicanism had much more of a formative. It formed the ethos of the South, especially. Like, I mean, I always consider America as basically like coming out of the Virginian spirit, and Virginia was much more Anglican. Like, we always think of, like, the Puritans in Massachusetts and all that, but the Anglican spirit was much more obvious in the South, and people, I don't think, really appreciate how much Anglicanism actually shaped American Christianity in the early years.
Is there any places where you could maybe elaborate on that? Like, one of the things that at least sticks out to me a bit is the South has more of a view of a natural aristocracy, I think, where there is more of an understanding of natural hierarchy. And the Anglican Church has a more hierarchical church than the Presbyterians and the Reformed tend to. Do you think that that might carry over? Or is there anywhere else that you might see aspects of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the political institutions and our instincts about equality and hierarchy and things like that come out of religious debates. I mean, basically, um, you can also see it in, like, Puritan culture was very. You could use the word biblicist, where they had to justify everything by the Bible, especially like when it comes to law and order. The Old Testament had to be, the blueprint for their entire society in Puritan New England. The conformists and the establishment Anglican Church in the 17th century, in 16th century, was very much against that idea, and so they had much more of a a natural law flavor to them. And the implications of that is you could have a much more robust and classicalist literature and literary component to your society. In the South, you can see that everywhere. Like the Southern literature very much has that, whereas, Puritan New England produced a type of literature that was much more stodgy and less, creative. Like, if you look at, like, especially in this, like the Southern revival, like the new Southern writers, like the I'll Take My Stand types, like the literature that came and the music that came forth in the South. I think a lot of the creativity that they could appeal to their humanness and their human nature, and they didn't have to be restricted to the Old Testament and things like that. I think that really comes out in the culture of the Old South, the antebellum South. It had much more of a classicalist, aristocratic, beautifying feel to it. I think that reflected their attachments and cultural affinity with the Church of England. So like I think it existed even beyond the religious sphere. I mean, their entire culture down here was structured in a way that was unique from the North, just because of the way that they understood religion. So that's kind of elaborating on what you just said. Things like hierarchy are exactly right, and I think that's why, like, you didn't get the ruthless egalitarianism that basically came out of the North, that you do in the South. The South really appreciates roots. It appreciates its own history. It appreciates cultural continuity, I think, in a way that the North doesn't. The North is always perfect, trying to, it's not an accident. And I actually follow Paul Gottfried here. He's written a lot about the roots of like progressivism, and it's not an accident that progressivism came out of the North. When you secularize Puritan thinking, you got that mandate to reshape the American ethos, with an iron fist. And so the South, that was not, they were not interested in that. They wanted to keep their local and regionalist distinctives, and they were interested in participating in the proto progressivism of the mid 19th century, and also the progressivism that came later, with people like Woodrow Wilson and FDR and things like that too. So that kind of, it's an interesting to see that Puritan mindset and this idea that we're going to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth, and we're going to reshape the world. That's not how Anglicans approached, their cultural mandate, and so therefore, it's certainly not how the South approached its cultural mandate.
So it's actually interesting that you took that line of thought, because I was going to ask you to sort of break down your thoughts on the northern connection to Anglicanism. So one thing that I find interesting is you did make a brief reference to the conformist. The Northerners were the descendants of nonconformists to an extent, but they didn't entirely see themselves as, a completely separate project, I think, from what the Anglican Church is doing. So, for example, if you look at who I would argue, if you had to pick one man as the sort of founding father from a theological perspective of the Puritans, I would say it was actually William Ames. So William Ames never made it to America. He was planning on it. I think he'd actually already purchased his ticket, but he died of pneumonia following a flooding in his house, I think just weeks before his departure. His wife and children ended up moving to New England after his death. But his book, The Marrow of Theology, ended up becoming the closest thing you can get to a foundational theological text for the Puritans. The reason that's important is because Ames was a nonconformist, but Ames also didn't advocate for full separation from the Church of England. He advocated for a type of congregationalism that could sort of exist still within the general communion of the Anglican Church. It's actually kind of similar, ironically, to what ACNA does now. if you're familiar with kind of how they operate. But anyway, so I was going to ask you if you could explain some of that connection, because later on, too, you saw a lot of these old Congregationalists from the North move into the Anglican and Episcopal churches afterwards. So I was wondering if you could.
I think I missed. You wanted me to explain something, and then I heard Episcopalian.
So the Episcopalian Church is similar in many ways to the Anglican Church, and I think that same movement that brought people into the Anglican Church, that same movement that brought some of the old Congregationalists into the Episcopalian Church, also brought them into the Anglican Church as well. So I was just wondering if you could, if you had any thoughts on the sort of Anglican roots, and then also sort of, if you want to say, the Anglican conclusion a little bit, because that movement came sort of towards the end of the more Christian dominance of the North.
Yeah, I actually haven't taken a lot of time to understand the dynamics of Anglicanism in the North. I have a very simplistic understanding where the Puritans, the nonconformists, and separatists were up north, which is, basically too basic to be interesting. And then the, people who had a much deeper appreciation for the church's traditions, came to the South. But what was I going to say on that? Episcopalian. So, I mean, basically, more or less, the Episcopalian Church came out of the fact that you can't, because of the theological structure of England, the king was, the monarch was over the Church of England, right? Like he was the chief, of all the people, and so therefore he was over the Church. So that was the English model, and because of that, you couldn't theologically make it work once the Americans separated from England and they were no longer under the purview of the king. They therefore could no longer call themselves the Church of England. It wouldn't work because the king was no longer had any jurisdiction here. So they became Episcopalians. And so that's literally what happened, is once the Revolutionary War was successful for the Americans, they could no longer be part of the Church of England. They were no longer part of that national identity anymore. And so a lot of them were Anglicans. They were the Church of England folks, and they literally just had to reconstitute after the war because it didn't work anymore politically. I mean, the church was so tied up with the political state in England at that time in the late 18th century that once the Americans separated, they literally just weren't part of the church. So it was a theological crisis as well. But what they basically did was they basically just started with a blank slate and said, look, we have all these structures, we have our downstream churches, but now we're just the Episcopalian Church. I mean, that's, from my understanding, that's basically what happened.
Now, looking at the Anglican Church today, you kind of have it's almost like, I believe they started, what word am I looking for here? Women started becoming pastors, priests, whatever, in the church in 2006, 2000, or was it the 90s? It's been
In the
within
Anglican Church?
yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was at a lower level. It was, much earlier than that. I mean, C.S. Lewis was writing about the crisis of women's ordination in the 1940s.
So it seems like it really started to take off in the latter part of the 20th century, early 21st century. But with the Episcopalians, you could kind of say that they started to already become heretical in 1970 once they started. There was a group of, what was it, 4 women that they basically had a midnight ordination of them. In the
something like
Episcopalian
that.
church. They had to do it. It's always funny, you have to do these secret things at night, unbeknown to the rest of the populace, and then say, oh, we did the thing already, and we said the magic spell, we're good. Now women are priests. So you had that happen. I guess you could say the Episcopalians went south before the Anglican Church did. And now you're seeing that the Anglican Church is now going south very fast. And King Charles is supposed to be I believe, the faith, and he tried to change it to faiths with an S, to include all faiths, which doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah.
It shows the lack of understanding that elites, or maybe not understanding, but just the evil malice they actually have and contempt for their heritage and their roots. But do you think that that's a problem with, I guess, the Americans, that we apostated with our version of Anglicanism first than the British did? Or do you think that it just the times of the culture both were going to eventually to do that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Obviously, that's a broader question. You know, is Western Europe under the cultural occupation of America, or are they both participating in some overall spirit? Um, I do think that there is a case to be made for America being sort of the cultural empire of the Western world, and it being the engine. And obviously, it's leveraging forces that it still has connections with in the Church of England and also in England and Europe in general. But I really do think that because we have all the cards, because the dollar is so powerful, um, they don't really have a choice. They have to lean into a spirit that might exist there anyways. But you know, if they tried to push away that spirit and return to traditional England, I don't think they would be politically allowed to, and I think that they know that. So I think there is a case to be made for America being the driver of so much of this, and it originating in America. We've idolized some of our rhetoric about individual freedom and individual rights, and you know, the self fulfillment and the ability of an individual to define and live his life in whatever way, whatever capacity he wants to live it. We have absolutized that and exported it to Europe. We've be this whole culture of self hate that was largely driven by the United States in Germany in the 1960s and 70s. I think has been also exported to all of Greater Europe, and so I think America does have a role to play in reshaping Europe and Americanizing it. And by Americanizing it, I mean specifically deracinizing it and separating it from its own cultural, you know, and traditional social roots. For sure, I think that there's a case to be made for that. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't go along willingly. I think there were forces in England that were happy to play along with that. But I think America ultimately had the big stick, and you know, they were willing to use it.
What? So you hold the view that that Europe wouldn't have become leftist if America hadn't gotten involved with it?
Then America, what?
I'm saying, so you hold the view that Europe was coerced into becoming liberal from the United States, and that they weren't already, you know, in that world before we got there.
That's, I mean, I go back and forth on that, but I do think that we exacerbated it. You know, whatever you can say about the origins of it, I think we exacerbated it. You know, so especially as it existed in the post-Marxist left. I mean, Britain was already, you know, full of Marxist influences and communist influences and left-wing influences, but the Frankfurt School was, you know, came to Brooklyn, came to New York, and it was exported back out to Europe. So I do think a lot of that specific flavor of leftism, I think, really did come from the American context for sure.
Basically,
I mean,
they
to,
exported the
oh, go
gay to
ahead.
Brooklyn, and then we exported it back even more gayer to them.
Well, I mean, yeah, but like that, the Frankfurt School didn't come from England; it came from Frankfurt, right? So,
Yeah,
I
Germany.
think that, and look, this is when you get into like the international billionaires and all of that stuff too. Like that's a major part of the play here. It's not like these heritage Americans are sitting there in New York and inviting these Frankfurt scholars to come and do their thing. I mean, there's definitely an internationalist, you know, thing at play here, but they were all based in New York.
I think Kaiser, you had something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that it needs to be understood by all of us too is that a lot of this is very new as well, and we kind of look back on America's origins, even when you're on the right on this side of things, where it's like, oh, this was all just some inevitable outcome that was just going to come about. In particular, one of the things that gets pointed out is, oh, the Declaration of Independence, and I've heard it's a philosophical time bomb that was always going to end up where we're at because they said things like all men are created equal. But I think when you actually have this rootedness of understanding of the Anglican tradition, of the views at this time, you understand that largely what they were getting at when they said all men were created equal was all men between the Anglos that were over in America and the Anglos that were over in Britain were both equals. That's what they were promised from the days of the Virginia Charter. And even when you look at like Jefferson, who gets reworked, I think, a lot into like a deist and all of these things, he was still an Anglican vestryman for his entire time. And I guess what I'm just trying to get at with that is, do you think that it was that? Because that's largely what I try to fight against, is this idea that, oh, all of these things were just inevitable outcomes of Americanism? Or do you think that there were specific points where things shifted in a way where they didn't have to along these lines?
Yeah, I don't take the view that all of this was inevitable. I mean, that might be like the Curtis Yarvin view. I think that there were some like independent scholars like Thomas Paine that may have been proto, whatever you want to call it now, leftists, like liberals or whatever. So there may have been some components of that, but I don't think the general ethos of the American founding was what we think it is today. I think you're right that Jefferson had a very contextualized understanding of things like all men are created equal. I think a lot of it too was a sort of class observation, where he's saying that like there's all of these yeoman farmers, there's planters, there's kings, there's independently wealthy like merchants, and of the various class structures, all of them actually should have the same political capabilities and the same political say. And so he did have a little bit more of an egalitarian spin within the context of English history and hierarchy. I don't think it's appropriate to do what we've done today, which is to universalize that phrase and say that anybody around the world has these exact same rights. I think Jefferson would have thought that was absurd, and his own individual way of living, the structures of his own household and plantation life and all of that, basically just shove that interpretation into a bottle. It makes no sense. I really think it was contextual. I also think that a lot of it was political. I agree with Russell Kirk that he was using this to appeal to France to side with the American cause against the English because they needed French resources and military and political support. So I think a lot of it was a little bit like Machiavellian to employ that. And the reason is because in France, obviously, the work of people like Thomas Paine and the egalitarian character of their revolution was very much alive in their hearts at the time. So I think some of that was at present, but I really don't think that it was built into the American experiment to universalize all of this. I think we impute these things back into the founding to justify the post-civil rights American social order and world empire, basically the civil rights regime. So I think that they impute that back into Jefferson in a way that I think Jefferson would have thought absurd, and he never could have imagined how his words would have been twisted to justify, the gay race communism, basically.
Yeah, I mean, if you read Jefferson's writings, it's painfully obvious he doesn't mean all men are created equal in the sense that they are equal in ability or anything like that. I mean, he has writings that go into quite a bit of detail to the opposite. He was speaking more in terms of people being equal, more in terms of what we would call as equal represented under the law. That's more what he had in mind. Like the idea that men are sort of born without particular obligations to other men, and that's more of a political treatise thing about what men have the freedom to do as men, and that's very different than saying that. Jefferson wasn't saying all people have the same talents or the same gifts or anything along those lines.
If I could also on Thomas Paine, because he is so poorly understood, he gets treated in school and on all these things as, oh, he's just one of the equals. Actually, he was huge because he had common sense, but they don't talk about very much about what happened after that, where Thomas Paine, once he writes Age of Reason, once he goes off in this direction, he burns every bridge that he has with every single founding father. They write him letters like Sam Adams is telling him, please, man, what are you doing right here? Are you trying to cause strife? Are you trying to ruin things? The end of his life, he is so alienated for his deistic beliefs that he is begging the Quakers on his deathbed to let him be buried with the Quakers because that was who he was closest to. And the Quakers said, no, we're not going to let you be buried in our cemetery because of the beliefs and the things that you hold. He was penniless. He was friendless. He had 6 people attend his funeral. And the last words of his obituary in his local newspaper was they asked some citizen to give a comment, and he said he did some good and much harm. Like his views, his beliefs, the way he was despised by the American public. He went from someone who was one of the key people to creating America and getting us to go to independence to he's hated. Nobody cares for him. No one would even show up for his funeral. Just wanted to throw that in there because it needs to be stated more just where he ended up.
No, I completely agree with you, and I'm glad you brought up the historical point. But I've said this for years that he's like the most like overrated American founder. He wasn't even really a founder. He was just like kind of a rogue blogger was basically what he was. And he's way overstated today. And in fact, the reason I think he's so popular is because they can use him to reconstruct the meaning of American history.
Oh, no, 100%. Even John Adams at the time, like Common Sense was relatively popular. But John Adams was saying this is a load of, like, this is a diatribe, like, this is terrible. He basically, even Common Sense, which was his most popular one, was not very popular among most of the founders because they could see a lot of the implications that he was getting at, that it was so far away from a lot of the things that they believed.
Yeah, exactly. I think that most of the American founding was not Enlightenment, individualism as we think of it today. I think it was very much like Protestant. I mean, like you have to remember that like at the time that all of these states are signing on to the Constitution in 1789, half of them had like established state mandated churches. They were funded by taxpayer money. Like these were theocracies. And like the idea that they're really into like Thomas Paine, individualism and deism, I think it's just like ludicrous. And I think it's like Looney Tunes history. It makes no sense.
No, it's very clear that like, and it needs to be more dived into. It's one of the passion projects that I have, but I believe that even most of their deism is largely fake. Like one of the things that you'll come across is they'll say they use deistic language like providence. They claim that calling things providence is deistic, which it just simply isn't. You can find sermons all over from Anglicans, from Puritans, from like the most religious fanatics that existed in America using providence as language. It was just what was very common for them to talk about God in that light of like, this is God providing for us. And to go a little bit more into just the origins of America, you really do have to start outside of America and go back to the Anglos, go back to the Anglo-Saxons and how they lived. And you see again in Jefferson and again in all of these guys, they're talking about America in the sense that we're actually like closer to the Anglo-Saxon governance as it used to exist pre-Norman and these ancient Anglo-Saxon traditions than even some of the English are. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to push. I mean, just one example that's really easy to see with that is the name Saxon means knife man because they were so common to carry weapons. And you're going to see a lot more people carrying weapons in America than you are going to be in Britain, as just one example where you just see like this culture, these religious views, these things. We are just an extension of this people. We're a group of settlers who split, had our own foundations, have our own genesis, and we are distinct. But you have to go back and see where we started from, and then it becomes very clear that we are not just a country that just popped out of nowhere in 1776. We have thousands of years behind the development, these ideas, these beliefs that we don't understand, that we need to get to. Because that will also show us that we can't just bring in anyone onto our magic dirt and then suddenly they're just going to agree to all these ideas that have been built up for generation after generation. That even if you are disconnected from them, even if you don't understand it, even if you don't get it, it still plays through your worldview, the way that you see things, the way that you think about things, including, I think, religiously, where, like, I think, yes, the Anglican Church is largely not something most people will attend, but I think that even today we do see a lot of this bleed through, a lot of the ideas still persisting as like vestiges. Do you see any of those today as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things you said really, struck me. A lot of, and I want to comment on this. A lot of people think that because these mainline, especially like the Church of England or whatever, they're so captured that there's no point in even getting into it. And I can understand not joining. I'm not part of the Anglican Church or anything, but I think that like there is something very valuable in like retaking what is ours, because I think in a sense it belongs more to us that appreciate the role that it played than it belongs to those who are undermining its own character from within. I think it belongs more to us. And so I think that one of the things that's important is we can capture the little wins right now in 2025 and 2026, the little wins. But I really have this sense that over the next 100 years, the wins are going to get bigger. They're going to get bigger. And they're ultimately, the goal is to have it culminate, maybe, in 100 years, culminate in the total recapturing of these historic institutions like the Church of England. How cool would it be long after we're dead that our grandchildren or great grandchildren, because of our work today in preserving it and praising it and promoting it, that they recapture it? It's like the final boss of retaking the American tradition is to retake the church. I love that vision. And so I think that even though it seems like a billion miles away and it's very impossible to have any, influence or anything like that in the Church of England, I still think it's worth a lot of time and bandwidth to recover and appreciate and promote how, and if I could just say based, the Church of England's history is. I mean, it was born of blood with King Alfred in Anglo-Saxon, and we need to appreciate that and hold those people up as our heroes. We stand on their shoulders and we operate with their praise in mind. And so that, I think that's so important for us to instill in our children a love of the things that are right now being tarnished.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because especially coming from I'm a bit of a younger guy, but just the people that are even younger than me that are just like starting out, they have like no connection to anything for the most part, and they don't really have much of an understanding of really much of what went on or how things are going, and they only have just this like blip of time where they're like aware of like history for like 10 years at most. Like it kind of often just starts with Donald Trump. Like they don't even know what came before that.
Mm-hmm.
And they have no grasp of just what has been built up for them. They also don't understand just how difficult it was to get to where we are as safe as how good life is in a lot of ways, and just how bad it could be. And when you start to like read about Jamestown and what they were doing, where you did have like people who were still willing to put a church in this swamp in this middle of this area as people are starving, it shows just how powerful that was, and also just how much they sacrificed, how many died just to get you to where you are now. And then it gives you something that's actually worth fighting for instead of just giving up the towel and throwing up, especially again when you have heroes. You really do need to read up on, if you have not, Alfred the Great and what he did in defeating the Vikings. There's all these people who are all about like paganism and all of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, the Christian Saxons won, beat them, forced him into Christianity afterwards. Well, kind of forced. He mostly agreed to it because he realized that his God lost to ours.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, you just see these connections and these threads, and it just gives you this appreciation, and it gives you something that you can then pass on and a reason to actually keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, when King Alfred was going through England was more lost than we are today. We can take it back. If he can do it, we can do it. It's going to take rethinking what it means to have a a Christian society, and you can't operate as if Christianity is only in the spiritual realm and it's all fixated on what happens when you die and things like that. But if you actually can rethink about the here and now, and the fact that we have this obligation and this duty to fight for political institutions that reflect the fact that Christ is king of everything, then we actually can get confrontational politically as Christians and as churches. And I think that King Alfred did it, and we should recover that.
Yeah, if I could just lay it out for people who don't know how bad England was at that time. England and the rest of the British Isles were set up as these petty Saxon kingdoms, and one by one, this massive heathen army of Danes was just destroying them one after another, every kingdom falling down to Wessex, and Wessex itself gets destroyed for the most part. Alfred has one final battle with like the remnants of what he has after losing again basically everything, manages to pull a win out, draws up a peace treaty where they have the Danelaw, and then he's able to push forward with this view of England. And so when we look at America right now, like, we're not in a great spot by any means. We have lost most of our institutions, but we still have a large swath of the population on our side. We still have the fact that we actually want to have children. We actually don't want to just commit to this like hedonistic suicide where we're just going to burn out and travel and do whatever and enjoy little pleasures and never give anything to the future and then die, which is the general left-wing worldview of how you should live. We have more that we're willing to actually put forward. And largely, like, we have all of the tools to do so in this heritage and these things that we have. We don't really have to draw on much more than our own history and our own things that have come before us in order to figure out how do we resolve this mess now.
Yeah, agreed.
So, Kevin, any final questions, anything that we had come in that we want to get out before we wrap up? Anything that's interesting might have come through?
Yeah, give me 1 sec. I'll show it here on the screen. We did have one question. It's from Reformed Armenian. What are your thoughts on Alan Carlson's theory that veterans experiences overseas during World War II greatly, I guess, the drive towards degeneracy? Sorry.
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, first of all, I'm a huge Alan Carlson fan, so if he says it, I endorse it. I haven't really thought about it though. I guess what he's saying is that, like, we saw hell on earth during World War II, and maybe they came home to cope. I don't know if that's kind of what he's driving at. I do think that we kind of came back from Europe with this vision of America, maybe that was a little bit triumphalist. And we thought that because we conquered the world, we had the moral right to reconstruct our own society in a way that catered to our own hubris. I mean, that might be part of it. I would actually be interested in learning more about this. I actually really appreciate Alan Carlson. I don't know exactly what he's driving at here, but I do think that the generation that kind of took political power in America after World War II very much did set the tone for an era of, like, getting your guard down morally, politically. Like, they're the generation that led in the third world. They're the generation that led to one of the greatest, like, sexual degeneracy booms in world history. So I do think that there's definitely a correlation there, but I'd be interested in understanding the causation.
Great. Thank you, CJ. So we're coming up to the bottom of the hour. Any final thoughts, CJ, before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I guess, I'll just give me a general thought. People always ask, are you white pill or black pill or whatever? And I'm kind of known or I used to be known as a doomer. but I'm not. And I think that the reason for that is because we've learned to appreciate the stakes. I really think that in the last 2 or 3 years, Americans understand the existential nature of what we're going through. I think in a way that I didn't foresee. We always laugh about the grill Americans and the people that would just rather watch the football game than get involved in politics. And I think that is basically no longer the chief characteristic of young right wing men. I think they really do care a lot. And with Trump and Stephen Miller and Vance, maybe we can't say they're perfect, but we can say that our guys are getting into positions of influence. And I can say for certain, because I know some of these people, that there are very good right-wing heritage Americans in staff positions all over Washington. And I trust them. I know them. And good things are happening. And I think that we just have to continue to fight and double down. And the Americans, the American right wing of 2026 needs to make the American right wing of 2025 look like liberals. And that we need to do that every single year. We need to push the Overton window. And I think that we really have a bright future ahead of us. It's going to be some struggle, probably some violence, but I think our children will be able to take up where we've left off. And so I would encourage everyone to just keep pushing it, because we're doing great things.
All right, great. Thank you so much, C.J. And before we leave tonight, do you have anything that you would like to show or plug to the audience?
Well, I mean, I have the Canterbury Trails podcast, like you mentioned. I have Contra Mundum that I do with Andrew Isker. My Twitter feed is always active and lively, and that's at Contra Mordor, where you can find me. So I'm very active there. I have the 2 podcasts. Andrew and I, are starting a church. Andrew's been ordained in the CREC. And so has a good solid history there. And we're trying to continue his ministry by building the church with our project that we're doing in Tennessee, where we are basically inviting as many families as we can find who are interested in moving to Tennessee, into a great region, to start that rebuilding effort. We're politically organized, and we want to show the world, we want to show the nation that by working together in aligned projects, that we really can fight back and make a difference. And so we're starting a church there. We just did a funding drive for the land, and you asked me before we came on if I wanted to promote that. Well, the answer is yes. We always welcome resources, but we did fund the land from that, and it really shows us that people believe in what we're doing, and we're excited to have done that and to keep growing. And so every month is another step forward.
Great. Thank you so much again, CJ. And we really appreciate you coming on tonight, and really good episode. On our end, all of our follows on X are in the description. CJ, his X handle is in the description as well. If you're interested in joining the NGS or the OGC, our emails are also in the description. And that will do it for tonight. We appreciate your time, and see y'all next week. Have a good night.